With Cyberpunk 2077's Phantom Liberty expansion and 2.0 update, there are quite a lot of changes to the base game and to the technology driving the games. From the DF perspective, the update to the game's full ray tracing overdrive mode with DLSS 3.5 ray reconstruction is perhaps the most intriguing. As of version 2.0, all RTX users from Turing, Ampere, all the way to Ada Lovelace GPUs can now select the DLSS 3.5 ray reconstruction tech in the game menu to enhance the visuals when using the RT overdrive mode. So what does this DLSS 3.5 bring to the table? And what other tech changes are there in Cyberpunk 2077's 2.0 version? I will cover that and more in this video, but first, before I get into the changes themselves specifically, I want to talk conceptually about what DLSS 3.5 ray reconstruction is. Why does it even exist? What is the point? To get into that, let me explain denoising a bit. Basically, in a game with ray traced effects, any of the pixels that are affected by ray tracing need to be denoised. Take, for example, Quake 2 RTX here, where the entire image is essentially path traced. You can turn off the denoiser in that game and you can see the raw ray tracing hit results and shading. Completely noisy, and obviously not how you'd want to play the game. With a software program called a denoiser, developers try and clean up this mess of pixels and noise to make coherent visuals that do not flicker or sparkle like when the denoiser is off. In Quake 2 RTX's case, it's a combination of denoisers called ASVGF. And although I can simply toggle it on and off in Quake 2 RTX, it is far from a simple thing. Denoising is incredibly complex and full of hazards. At times, denoising can overly blur surfaces. It can lead to ghosting of light and objects, and lighting can lag, where shadows and lighting can take a number of seconds even to take on their full proper look. In a game with many ray traced effects, there can also be many special steps for the denoiser, all of which may require hand tuning on a per scene basis to get the best visuals possible with the least amount of artifacts. There's entire research and presentations from game developers and engineers about how to tune denoisers to get the most out of them. A lot of working hours are put into denoising. DLSS 3.5's goal is essentially to simplify it, to do away with multiple specialized denoisers that are hand-tuned by engineers. It is looking to save time, money, and effort that humans spend trying to figure out denoising manually. It is instead saying a machine learning program running on the RTX GPUs on their tensor cores can do it better. It can decide which current pixels and past pixels to use to clean up very noisy ray traced or path traced images. That is the hope, at least, that we can save engineering sweat and tears, and we can perhaps also increase the quality of denoised results better than what perhaps humans could do with manual tweaking. And I will talk about that later in the video on where it is successful and what the quality differences are. Another thing that DLSS 3.5 is trying to do is to temporally reconstruct the image at the same time it is denoising it. In the past, this wasn't the case. We can see this in Remedy's Control, for example, which when using DLSS, denoising actually occurs at the lower internal resolution of the DLSS specific mode. So in DLSS performance mode at 4K, that would mean denoising is at 1080p. DLSS then upscales that denoised result to 4K. The issue here is that it will lead to things like reflections looking noticeably chunkier and blurrier when using DLSS than in comparison to a native 4K image. DLSS 3.5 is going to change that and make DLSS's reconstruction of ray traced effects like reflections look better, as the denoising is going to occur at the output resolution now. So in DLSS performance mode, denoising would then be done at 4K. So that is how it is in theory. Let us look at it in practice in Cyberpunk 2077's 2.0 patch in the base game. Here I'll be comparing the game with Ray Tracing Overdrive with DLSS in its performance mode at 4K with ray reconstruction on or off. As it is right now, DLSS ray reconstruction is only supported with DLSS on, so it won't work with DLAA. So keep that in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is that I'm comparing the game's state-of-the-art standard compute denoiser at that same internal resolution. I am not comparing the ray reconstruction images made to perfectly crisp offline reference path traced images or anything like that. This is not ground truth comparisons here. I don't have the ability to do that. So this isn't a test of how perfect images are. Rather, it's taking a look at the differences between the options that are available to the user. One denoiser done without machine learning and one done with it. All tests are of course done at the exact same time of day, with just the save being reloaded. So you can see things like NPCs at times or car placement being a little bit different. Or there's some other random elements in there like distant building lights looking a little different since those are randomized. Little things to keep in mind. Okay, with that being said, let us start with image quality while the camera is still. First with surface texture quality and then reflection quality. In this first image I captured at the edge of the opening of this garage, I want us to specifically pay attention to the ground here. In both images, the lighting is the same, and this area is primarily lit from the sky and bounce lighting from outdoors. This is pretty sparse lighting. With ray reconstruction, the normal map texture on the ground definitely shows up much better. I would say the traditional denoiser on the left is blurring the ground texture in an obvious way, making it look like the ground texture lacks anisotropic filtering. The texture quality in indirectly lit areas like this one here seems to be an area where the new ray reconstruction tech in DLSS 3.5 has good advantages. Same thing in this image here. If we look at the mattress on the ground here, I want you to notice how much more detail is visible in the texture work on that mattress. It just appears that DLSS 3.5 denoiser is much better at reconstructing normal mapped surface detail than the previous denoiser. Another aspect that it is better at is also seen here with small shadow and lighting detail. Take a look at the area around the locker. Notice how the self shadows there under the wall, on the locker itself, or on the corrugated metal behind the locker are much more defined, easier to see. This is something that DLSS 3.5 just does better than the previous denoiser. In any shot of the game you can really find, small objects or small shadow details are better preserved instead of being blurred out by the denoiser. As a reminder, these small shadows from punctual light sources or from the sun should be very crisp and hard-edged, as that is physically correct. They should realistically only be blurred if the level of parallax with the light is greater or if the light size is dramatically larger, like a big area light. So yes, shadows now are much more defined in a realistic manner than in the previous denoiser. One area of texture detail that is quite a bit better in the new version of the denoiser is on characters, and specifically on character faces. Now, originally I didn't even know to look for this difference, but I was tipped off to it by CD Projekt Red's own art director, Jakub Knapik, who was commenting that the new denoiser improved the quality of textures on character faces. To show this off, let's look at Jackie in the older version of the denoiser. If we zoom in on his face a bit, we can see that his skin looks rather soft here. His skin almost looks buffed out a bit, I would say, blurred a bit. And we don't see a lot of the stubble, the wrinkles, and more shining through there. And that's detail that, according to the game's art director, that should be there. Now let us switch over to the new 3.5 denoiser. The big difference I want to point out is all in that skin. Notice how the texture of the skin is much more visible now. How we can see more of the pores and that normal map detail there. We can see a bit more of the stubble from his beard, but the biggest detail change I would say is how the normal maps under his eyes are actually showing up now, whereas they don't actually show up at all before. And they show off quite well that Jackie is definitely not a smooth-faced youth anymore. He's actually a bit grizzled, and he's seen better days. So a lot more texture detail is showing through here with DLSS 3.5, and it's doing on an animated and complex character. The old denoiser definitely struggled with faces in comparison, and that's something that CD Projekt Red wanted to even point out to me. Okay, so that is texture detail. Now let us look at reflection detail in stills. One of the easiest places to see the difference is in this shot here of a puddle. In the previous denoiser, we can see an issue that I showed off earlier in Control. Basically, the reflections denoising is done at the lower internal resolution. So it lacks detail and it has obvious blockiness from the internal resolution. With DLSS 3.5, well, it looks a lot higher resolution, quite simply. It looks like the output resolution. So we can see a lot better reflection detail than in the previous denoiser. And for perfectly smooth reflections, like this one we see here, scenes you can see a lot more detail in them than you could have possibly ever seen before. So a lot of that detail is preserved in the reflection. For rougher reflections, it tends to mean that you will see more of the surface normal map detail shining through instead of being erased by the denoiser. The denoiser was kind of getting rid of a lot of surface detail from reflections before, something that DLSS 3.5 doesn't seem to struggle with as much. Okay, now let's talk about image stability and lighting quality. In my discussion with CD Projekt Red's Jakub Knapik, he pointed out that Cyberpunk 2077 city design is a big challenge for lighting in general, and especially for denoising. There are these tall and overlapping structures which block direct lighting from the sun, so you have little nooks and crannies in the world beneath and between buildings that tend to be only lit by light that has been bounced from somewhere else. This sparse indirect lighting is then combined with the fact that most surfaces in Cyberpunk 2077 are reflective in some way, usually highly reflective, with rough or smooth surfaces. As the art director said, these two properties in reality are conflicting desires for a denoiser. The denoiser should want to smooth out results in these heavily occluded areas to make the game lit well, but it also needs to be highly reactive because the surfaces being lit are reflections, and reflective surfaces require a reactive denoiser, otherwise you get a lot of ghosting. With the old denoiser, this was an area where many failure cases could occur. Take a look at this area here. It's completely lit indirectly by second-order bounces of skylight or sunlight. The metal surface detail in the scene with the old denoiser combined with DLSS in its lower internal resolution led to flickering on the metal surfaces and fizzle. With the new DLSS 3.5 denoiser, you can interestingly see how this has been completely removed, and the image is much more stable now, which leads to a higher visual quality, I would say. This also applies to any really sort of metallic object in the game, like this car door here. The metal is not a perfectly smooth reflection. It's a bit rougher, so the rays of light coming off of it have more random directions, which is hard to denoise. So in the old denoiser, we can see a kind of swimming of pixels that it can occur in the surface of the car door and the handle. That doesn't happen in the DLSS 3.5 denoiser. Another difference in areas that are indirectly lit can be seen here. Check this out. If I flip back and forth between the old and the new denoiser, I want you to notice how the old denoiser makes this area darker than the new denoiser, and how the new denoiser actually has a lot more defined surface detail and less flicker, for example, if you pay attention to something like the fan's movement. Basically, the old denoiser has trouble stabilizing light in areas that are very sparsely lit, so it kind of homogenizes them to be a bit darker than they arguably should be. DLSS 3.5's denoiser is apparently better adept at retaining lighting in the image versus the old denoiser, so areas are not as overdarkened with the new one. Last thing to mention about these images in stills is in regards to shadows from the sun. Basically, with the old denoiser, when the shadows from the sun were long and thin, so like at sundown, they could alias and flicker at times, and we can see this is another area where the new denoiser does a better job on the right here. So as a whole, in total, I would definitely say DLSS 3.5 makes the game look quite a bit higher resolution, with a lot better surface texture detail, and of course more stable and detailed reflections, which in total make this ray tracing overdrive mode in the 2.0 patch just look a lot higher res. And I think that's going to be the immediate impression most people will have who flip ray reconstruction on and off when they get their hands on 2.0. But how does this DLSS 3.5 hold up in motion? Now here I want to focus on a couple things. The first being reflections in motion. With classical denoising, like I showed off in Spider-Man earlier, moving the camera with reflections can cause smearing, and this is a really common thing to see in games with ray traced reflections. And Spider-Man has it all over the place. It's a common problem. In Cyberpunk 2077 with ray tracing overdrive, this is an even bigger problem actually, because one, Cyberpunk 2077 overdrive has ray traced reflections being applied to more objects in general, not just more mirror-like ones that are biased to be more like mirror reflections. It applies to really rough materials. Cyberpunk 2077 also has a lot of reflective materials in it. It's the design of the game world. And we also see a lot of moving parts here with civilians and cars moving around the scene. So reflections are a lot harder to do in Cyberpunk 2077 than perhaps in other games. So blurring and trails in motion is something that would definitely happen with the old path traced denoising. Given those challenges, let's look at a reflection here while the camera is moving laterally with the original denoiser versus DLSS 3.5 ray reconstruction. Look at the reflection of the neon text. I think it's really easy to see the legibility of that text in the reflection is greatly improved with DLSS 3.5. With the old standard denoiser, it was unreadable due to smearing of the reflection, but DLSS 3.5 keeps it cleaner. I would say though it isn't exactly pixel perfect or anything with DLSS 3.5 at this resolution. It is better, I would say, but I imagine a ground truth image would keep the surface detail visible in the reflection surface itself. So you would see a bit more of that bumpiness of the road. But it is unarguably better than the previous state-of-the-art solution that you as a player would have had access to. I see a very similar situation when moving along the axis of depth here with this car, moving forward on a rain-slicked road. There are far less fireflies, as in flickering pixels, and distortion in the reflections while moving with DLSS 3.5. The reflections are more coherent as a whole and much more stable, which is a very positive image quality aspect. But much like I said with the previous example, I think the road in movement does lose a bit of its normal mapped detail while moving at this resolution at least. Something I imagined a referenced path traced image would definitely not have. But still, overall, this is a genuine upgrade over the previous state-of-the-art available to the user. Another area of lighting lag that could be seen with the old denoiser, and basically in all real-time denoising, is light lag that occurs when a light rapidly switches on or off or changes in temperature. Let's look at the old denoiser first so you know what I mean. Take a look at this massive screen on the left of area lights. With each change of the color, I want you to notice how the lighting area around the car and somewhat on the car itself takes a while to change. The lighting in the environment is misaligned in timing due to light lag induced by the denoiser. If I count the amount of frames, it takes 1.5 seconds for the illumination to finally settle after a light color change occurs in this shot specifically. So there is a good amount of lighting lag here in this scene. For DLSS 3.5, it does it much more rapidly. And if we put them back to back, I want you to notice how it takes half the time, about 0.8 seconds after the light grid changes color, the lighting will fully settle on the DLSS 3.5 side. It's not perfect, of course, in this specific example, and I think there's going to be an area of iteration in the future for ray tracing and perhaps ray reconstruction, but it is a core issue in ray trace lighting that has been now cut in half. 100% better. That is a pretty large improvement for just a software difference. The biggest area of improvement over the previous denoiser is in light smearing and reflection smearing while moving, and this includes shadows and more. A good example can be seen here as this car accelerates rapidly forward. With the old denoiser, you should notice a couple of things. For one, notice how the blue lights and the red taillight on the bottom of the car stretch out into a smear behind and along the sides of the car as the car moves forward. The shape of their reflection on the road completely loses coherence in the old denoiser. It kind of looks like the Speed Racer movie, if you ever saw that. Another thing to notice is that when the car passes a streetlight with the old denoiser, you can see the car's shadow at that speed cannot keep up. If I pause, you'll see that the shadow is just smeared completely, losing nearly all of its shape, and it's also lagging behind the car in position. It's wrong. Now let us compare to ray reconstruction. On the right, we should notice a couple of things. First, when the car starts up, it's pretty easy to see that it no longer has that smearing of the tail light and the blue lights underneath the car body. Their reflections on the road stay coherent throughout the entire trip of the car, no matter its speed. Another thing that is awesome to see is what happens when the car moves past a streetlight. Look at its shadow in 3.5 versus the old denoiser. It's a completely coherent shadow on the right versus the smear of a laggy shadow in the old denoiser on the left. We can also notice other things like how the road is much easier to see and its per pixel detail shows out much better. Indeed, in motion, DLSS 3.5 is generally like this. Lighting looks near instantaneous for reflections in comparison to the old denoiser like I'm showing here. It's a generational quality difference. In other views, it can look even more obvious. Take me peeling out with this car in the shot here. Notice the lights under the car again in the old versus the new denoiser. They look like very coherent tube lights underneath the car on the right versus some sort of, I don't know, smear lacking any definition on the left. This is a pretty impressive showing in the difference of lighting coherence versus the old denoiser. So lighting responds much better to on and off states, and it keeps up with camera motion and object motion in a one-to-one way actually versus the old denoiser. It's a lot better. But DLSS 3.5 is not perfect, and now I will go into those areas where I specifically saw DLSS 3.5 having issues. The first one I noticed is that although lighting does not smear like it used to, and there is little to no flicker, there can be a kind of inner surface or surface edge smearing to moving objects of a small screen space size. That means thin objects or small objects like NPCs that are far from the camera or tiny things near the camera. And this happens in low lighting conditions, I found out. For example, check out this shot here. take a look at the ground here. In the old denoiser, we can see a visible can rolling on the ground. In the DLSS 3.5 view, well, it's hard to see the can because it's kind of been smudged and blurred. It's almost like the can isn't there. I also noticed it happening in this shot here while I was panning the camera. Look at the can on the ground. Yep, it's kind of an apparition of a can. You can also see this with NPCs at a distance in low lighting conditions, or even on the edges of character hands in low lighting conditions. Take a look at the difference in the NPC here in the old denoiser versus the new here. Yeah, the entire head and face of the NPC with DLSS 3.5 ray reconstruction in this shot here is looking rather odd. You can't really see much of that face anymore. It's just kind of blurred over. The second issue I saw with DLSS 3.5 is in regard to a certain look it can have. And this doesn't happen in all scenes, mind you. Far from. But I definitely noticed something happening, and I will call it posterization, which is a kind of stylization of rendering visuals. Check out this shot here. Now, I would 100% say here that DLSS 3.5 is doing a much better job than the old denoiser on the left. There's a lot more real detail being brought in there in the reconstruction, and the ground is not pixelated at all like it used to be before, and you can just see a lot of information in the texture work here that is just not present on the image on the left. Real texture information. But check out the look of it, I would say. And also notice the transition of color here on the edge of this appliance. It's a black shadowed edge with a light thin halo. To me, that looks like posterization and an over sharpened halo. This doesn't happen in all scenes in the game, but it can be visible in some areas of some scenes. So while there is generally always a lot more detail while using DLSS 3.5, and it's more stable and reactive and all those things I showed off earlier, there can sometimes be this stylization that can occur, this posterization of detail, and it can look like it has over-sharpened halos on that detail specifically. The last issue I noticed with 3.5 occasionally is that some thin objects will widen out. Now take a look at this shot here. I would say the old denoiser on the left definitely has a lot less bounce shadow detail along the wall's edge there. So yeah, the reconstruction is better on the right-hand side. But if we look at the grass, I want you to notice how it is, yes, of course, cleaner and better anti-aliased in DLSS 3.5, but it also lacks some of that per pixel fineness seen in the old denoised shot. DLSS 3.5 kind of widened out the grass here, and it reminds me a bit of how tent-filtered anti-aliasing can look. There's more stability there, but it could be less detailed technically. So DLSS 3.5 ray reconstruction is not perfect, and the issues I'm pointing out actually remind me a lot of those issues that we saw in the first few iterations of DLSS 2.0. Posterization and over-sharpening of edges, like I showed in my original DLSS 2.0 video on Control. And there's also some odd inner object and edge smearing at times when you really wouldn't expect it. And that reminds me a lot of things I saw in Hitman 3 when that launched, as well as in God of War when that launched. Those issues in DLSS Super Resolution have changed over time and gotten better, given how that is how machine learning works. So I'm thinking ray reconstruction could have a similar trajectory. My total review of ray reconstruction in this 2.0 version of Cyberpunk 2077, that it is hard to imagine ray tracing now in the future without ray reconstruction tech. I'm serious about that. It helps clean up so many of the typical ray tracing issues that I've come to know and then expect in my last 5 years of looking at ray-traced games. When it is working its best, ray reconstruction looks incredible, and it's kind of a watershed DLSS 2.0-like moment, I would say, for the graphics industry. And while generally looking a lot better than the old way of doing things, it also runs a bit better too. In this scene here, we can see the ray reconstruction running 4% better than the previous denoiser. It does that while looking genuinely better for nearly all the content that is thrown at it. And that is kind of the promise of DLSS, right? Managing to look a bit better while performing better, perhaps? So it's hard to complain. But for the issues that I did encounter, I will say, like I said when FSR 2 launched, that we're looking at the first iteration of something here. So the jury is still out on how and if it will improve. But given how it is machine learning, I think we can be a bit optimistic there. Okay, enough about 3.5 for now. I will also be covering it again when Alan Wake 2 comes out. And before I wind down this video, I want to talk about two other things with the 2.0 patch. The first is that now the game is slightly heavier on the CPU. This is hinted at in the new system requirements brought out by CDPR before the game came out, and I also could find it in-game. In my measurements using our little benchmark here that we use for GPUs and CPUs, the game ran around 10% slower on average versus the previous patch. The reasons for it running slower are hard to know, but technically version 2.0 of this game is going to be doing more with NPC behaviors like the police. So perhaps that's why, and it's definitely something to keep in mind, as 2.0 will be heavier on your CPU. On the GPU side of things, the game is mostly the same, except for Ray Tracing Overdrive mode if you have an Ada Lovelace GPU, which will now run significantly better in some areas of the game. Here in this park, for example, in this forest, version 2.0 runs 33% faster than version 1.65 at the same settings while using the old denoiser. And of course, using ray reconstruction, it's a bit faster as well on top of that. The reason for the speed up is because the game now uses opacity micromaps, an Ada Lovelace hardware feature that speeds up the ray tracing of partially transparent triangles, as you can see with game foliage usually. Other than that, I don't have much to say about the 2.0 version of Cyberpunk 2077, other than there's really no other game out there that looks like this at the moment. Visually, it's kind of ridiculously beautiful looking, and I'm happy CDPR has gone out of their way to keep pushing this game further. They keep improving on it, and they keep upping the ante and making it the shining beacon for visual excellence and as a forerunner in PC graphics technology. All that deserves praise as I see it. And with that being said, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did enjoy it, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to help us out, support DF on Patreon to get years of our content in high quality for download. Other than that, comment below, follow on Twitter, and as always, this is Alex bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.